Miss Langford, he said, his voice carrying a touch of hesitation. I wonder if I might steal you away for a moment? Beatrice looked at him, her gaze steady. She nodded, excusing herself from Lord Whitworth's company with grace. Of course, Your Grace, she said, her voice calm but with a hint of something softer beneath the surface. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They stood there, surrounded by the noise and bustle of the ball, yet completely isolated from it. The weight of the past weeks hung heavy between them, but so did the possibility of something new. Something neither of them had anticipated. Miss Langford, Marcus began, his voice steady. I cannot apologize enough for the way I treated you, for the game I played at your expense. I understand if you never wish to forgive me, but I can no longer pretend that this is just about a wager. It's about you. It's about what I've come to realize about myself through everything I've done. Beatrice looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment, before she finally spoke. I'm not sure forgiveness is what we need, she said quietly. But I'm willing to listen, to understand, to see where this might go, without the games, without the manipulation. Marcus smiled, his heart lifting. Then perhaps we can start over. No guayers. No expectations. Just us. Beatrice's lips curved into the smallest of smiles. Perhaps, she said, her voice filled with the same cautious hope that had once been buried beneath the weight of her frustration. As they stood there, amidst the noise of the ball, they both realized that what had started as a wager had become something far more complex, far more real. And in that moment, neither of them could predict where it would lead. But for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt a sense of hope, of possibility, a hope that maybe, just maybe, they could build something together. The late afternoon sun stretched its golden fingers across the city, casting a rich glow on the cobblestones of the most exclusive club in London, White's. Here, fortunes were made and broken, not by luck alone, but by the cleverness of the men who frequented these hallowed halls. Every whispered conversation was laced with the weight of power, and every challenge came with a price tag heavier than gold. It was a world where reputation meant everything, and failure could cost you more than money. It could cost you your very place in society. On this particular afternoon, however, it wasn't money that was at stake. It was something far more elusive, respect. And for Lord Peter Denby, the young, confident aristocrat, this challenge would be the very thing that could cement his status as the most brilliant gentleman in London. But even he had no idea just how far this wager would push him, or how much it would change the lives of those involved. Your reputation precedes you, Silverton, Lord Denby said, his voice carrying across the room with deliberate volume, ensuring every man in the room heard his challenge. He was toying with his glass of brandy, swirling it as he spoke, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. The architect, they call you. The man who can arrange marriages for the most hopeless cases. But tell me, do you really think that's a talent worth celebrating? Marcus Beaumont, the Duke of Silverton, looked up from his newspaper, his expression unchanging. His eyes, cold and calculating, studied the younger man with a hint of disinterest. At 34 he had seen it all before. The games. The challenges. The bets made by men too eager for approval. But this was different. This challenge, for all its audacity, had an edge to it. Something that stirred something deeper inside him, a feeling he had long forgotten, curiosity. Go on, Marcus said, his voice smooth, controlled. What is it you're proposing, Lord Denby? Quite simple, Denby continued, his voice growing louder with excitement. Miss Beatrice Langford. 7 complete seasons, 29 years old, and not a single proposal to her name. The eternal wallflower, the confirmed blue stocking. I wager £10,000 that even you, with all your celebrated skills, cannot marry her off to an earl or a gentleman of superior rank within 8 weeks. The room fell silent. £10,000 was a fortune that could buy a country estate or ruin a family. It was reckless, absurd, and utterly irresistible. Every gentleman in the room knew the implications of such a wager. And as the whispers began to swirl, Marcus felt a familiar rush of adrenaline. It wasn't the money that intrigued him. It was the challenge, the game, and the opportunity to outsmart the young upstart before him. 8 weeks. Marcus repeated, his gaze never leaving Denby's face. You're certain she's worth the risk? The younger man's smile widened, his confidence radiating from every word. I am. She's a woman who's been overlooked by everyone. 7 seasons of failure. Surely even you cannot overcome that. The terms were set, and the stakes were high. As Marcus accepted the wager with a simple nod, the rest of the room knew that this wasn't just about money. It was about more than that. It was about proving something. And neither man had any idea just how much they were about to lose in the process. The next morning, Marcus woke to a flurry of rumors. By the time he arrived at his club for the day's assembly, whispers followed him like a shadow. The bet had already taken root in society, and London's high society could do nothing but talk about it. From the salons of Mayfair to the drawing rooms in Bloomsbury, the wager about Miss Beatrice Langford spread faster than wildfire. The idea that such a woman, intellectually formidable, but socially invisible, was the object of such a reckless bet intrigued the masses. But for Marcus, it wasn't the chatter that concerned him. It was what came next. He had made a promise, a public one. His reputation as a man of unflinching control, a man whose mind was his greatest asset, depended on this bet. Beatrice Langford was no ordinary wallflower. Marcus had heard the rumors. Unfashionably tall, too thin, and worst of all, opinionated. She didn't fit the mold of what society expected in a lady. And yet, as he thought more about it, the challenge grew even more compelling. What if she wasn't the hopeless case everyone believed her to be? That afternoon, Marcus began his investigation, turning every stone he could find to learn more about Miss Langford. He tasked his secretary with making discreet inquiries, reaching out to anyone who might know something about her background. His aunt, the formidable Dowager Duchess of Silverton, had an extensive network of gossiping matrons who would be only too happy to share their knowledge. Within 48 hours, Marcus had compiled a detailed portrait of Miss Langford. The facts, at first glance, seemed dull enough. The daughter of the late Sir William Langford, a baronet whose death had left her with a modest income of £200 per year, Miss Langford had lived with her widowed aunt in a respectable, but hardly lavish home in Bloomsbury. She had no siblings, no family connections, and no prospects. 7 seasons had come and gone without a single offer of marriage. But as Marcus dug deeper, he found something that caught his attention. Miss Langford was no simpleton. She read philosophy. She discussed mathematics at gatherings where others spoke only of fashion or the latest scandal. In her spare time, she had written economic essays under the pseudonym Bartholomew Lawrence, essays that had been published in respected journals, including pieces quoted by Lord Whitfield in a speech to Parliament. This, Marcus thought, was no ordinary woman. She was a woman who had learned to hide her light in order to survive in a society that would never take her seriously. For the first time in years, Marcus found his interest piqued. The woman who had been dismissed as unremarkable, the woman no one thought worthy of a second glance, was a person of considerable intellect. In a world where the mind of a woman was often dismissed, Beatrice Langford had carved a space for herself in a way that most men could only dream of. Marcus spent that evening reading her essays. They were brilliant. Her critique of trade restrictions was sharp. Her proposals for banking reform radical yet practical. She wrote with precision and clarity that many men in his circle would envy. But what struck him the most was the underlying injustice. Here was a woman who had been overlooked for her brilliance simply because of her gender. And yet, her words had the power to shape policies and ideas that could affect the course of history. The very thought of it unsettled him. How many other women were there like her, hidden behind societal constraints, their minds dismissed and their talents wasted? The wager, for all its arrogance, had forced him to confront this injustice. For a moment, Marcus felt something shift inside him, an emotion he hadn't felt in years. Curiosity, yes, but also a strange sense of admiration. "I'll make sure she knows what I'm doing," Marcus muttered to himself as he closed the book. With a decisive snap, he was going to win this bet, but it wasn't just about the money anymore. There was more at stake now. The following week, Marcus took the next step in his plan. He had arranged the first meeting with Miss Langford under the guise of a casual encounter in Hatchett's bookshop on Piccadilly. He had chosen this venue because he knew she frequented it every Thursday afternoon, spending hours among the shelves, absorbed in her books. It was the perfect place for their first real conversation. And so he waited, his thoughts focused not on the bet, but on the woman he was beginning to see in a new light. When Miss Langford entered the shop that day, Marcus observed her with a mixture of fascination and calculation. She moved through the aisles with purpose, her head slightly bent as she examined the spines of books. She was tall, taller than most women, with sharp features that lacked the softness society typically admired. Her brown hair was pulled back simply, and her spectacles perched on her nose, enhancing the sharpness of her eyes. In a world obsessed with beauty and fashion, she was easily overlooked. But not by Marcus. As he watched her, something inside him stirred. He positioned himself in the philosophy section, apparently absorbed in a volume of Adam Smith, and waited. At exactly 3 o'clock, Miss Langford appeared, just as he had predicted. She moved with a quiet determination, selecting a book from the shelf and opening it as she began to read. The intensity in her gaze was palpable. It was clear that she didn't read for entertainment. She read to learn, to understand, to engage with the world on a level most people never bothered to reach. As she reached for another book on the same shelf, Marcus saw an opportunity. He took a step forward, allowing their paths to intersect naturally. "Remarkable work, isn't it?" Marcus said, his voice soft, yet unmistakably clear. Miss Langford looked up, startled. For a moment, their gazes met, her gray eyes magnified by the lenses of her spectacles. "I beg your pardon?" she asked, clearly surprised by his sudden attention. Marcus raised the book he was holding. "The Wealth of Nations," he said, nodding to the volume in his hand. "Though, I must admit, I find his theories on the division of labor less compelling than his moral philosophy." She paused for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a slight narrowing of her eyes, she spoke, her voice cautious but confident. "Most gentlemen claim to admire Smith without ever having read him. But I would argue that his concept of the impartial spectator is far more elegant than his analysis of labor. It suggests that morality can be understood through the lens of objectivity, regardless of personal bias." Marcus raised an eyebrow, impressed by her response. It wasn't the usual banter he encountered in drawing rooms or clubs. There was no small talk, no polite interest in the weather or the latest gossip. This was real intellectual engagement. "That is precisely the criticism Godwin raises," she continued, her voice taking on a slightly warmer tone. "Though I would argue that Smith's framework allows for education to influence moral reasoning without undermining an individual's capacity for moral judgment." For the first time in years, Marcus felt a spark of something familiar. A challenge, a feeling of being intellectually alive. He lowered his voice, stepping closer, not in a manner that could be construed as forward, but with the deliberate intent of engaging her in a conversation that transcended polite social niceties. "You've clearly thought about this," he said, his voice just above a whisper. "Your criticism of Smith is well argued. But I'm curious. How do you reconcile this with the complexities of societal pressures? Can we really divorce moral reasoning from the influences of society, education, and circumstance?" Miss Langford, slightly taken aback by the turn in the conversation, regarded him thoughtfully. Her lips moved slightly as she considered his words. Finally she spoke. "I believe Smith's theory can accommodate those influences. But it's crucial to recognize that society, in its ideal form, should allow for moral reasoning to flourish, independent of bias. Education shapes the mind, but it should not constrain it. It should allow people to think critically." Marcus felt a rush of excitement at her answer. She wasn't just parroting ideas she had heard in a salon or read in a book. She was thinking for herself, dissecting concepts with clarity and precision. For the first time, he realized that Miss Langford wasn't just a woman to be manipulated or set aside. She was someone who could stand shoulder to shoulder with the best minds of her generation. "That's a fascinating perspective," Marcus said, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "I must admit, I hadn't expected such an engaging conversation. And forgive me for not introducing myself properly. I am Marcus Beaumont, Duke of Silverton. We've met before, though I doubt you remember." Her eyes widened slightly as recognition dawned. "The Duke of Silverton," she repeated, a hint of surprise in her voice. "I do remember. It was at a musical, if I'm not mistaken. You were surrounded by others, and I was introduced only for a moment." Marcus nodded. That's right. It was hardly a proper introduction. And I confess I didn't take much note of it at the time. But I've heard much about your work, Miss Langford. Your critiques of economic policy, especially your proposals for banking reform, have caught the attention of some very influential people. For a brief moment he saw something flicker in her eyes. It wasn't surprise or pride. It was something deeper, an acknowledgement that her work had finally been noticed, even if the attention came from an unexpected source. I was unaware that my work had reached such circles, she said, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. I've only written a few essays, under the name Bartholomew Lawrence. They've never been meant for public consumption, only for my own understanding. Marcus could see it now. There was so much more to this woman than her appearances suggested. She wasn't just a brilliant mind hidden behind a pseudonym. She was a woman who had deliberately concealed her brilliance to avoid the social rejection that would have come with it. She was a woman who had played society's game, only to realize that the rules were stacked against her. I must confess, Marcus said, lowering his voice, that I've read your work. Your analysis of trade restrictions is particularly insightful. It's rare to find someone who can see through the layers of assumption that most people take for granted. You are a person of rare intelligence, Miss Langford, and I find myself intrigued by both your mind and your ideas. She hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words, before replying. You flatter me, Your Grace, but I am simply a woman who has spent years reading books and challenging ideas. I've never expected recognition for it. Marcus felt a pang of something unexpected. Guilt, perhaps, for having been part of the system that had ignored her potential for so long. But more than that, he was curious. Perhaps you've never sought recognition, but I think it's time the world paid attention to you, he said softly. And I'm afraid I might have a part to play in making that happen. The following days unfolded with a briskness that left Marcus with little time to dwell on the complexities of his growing feelings toward Miss Langford. He was, after all, still bound by the terms of his wager. But as the days passed, he found himself more and more invested in the challenge. What had begun as a simple game, a bet to prove his skill at matchmaking, was transforming into something far more intricate. He found himself not just scheming to win, but becoming increasingly intrigued by the woman behind the challenge. Miss Langford, for her part, seemed to resist any attempts to pull her into the kind of shallow society games that most women in her position would have eagerly embraced. She was sharp, witty, and unafraid to speak her mind, often to the dismay of those who believed a woman's place was in silence or ignorance. Marcus could respect that. He had always admired intellect, but even more so, he had come to admire her ability to challenge the norms without fear of judgment. As the weeks passed, Marcus' investigations into Miss Langford's life continued. His aunt, the Duchess, had introduced her to several influential hostesses, all of whom had been intrigued by her wit and intellect. In return, Marcus carefully orchestrated the social circles that would allow Beatrice to navigate her way into the very circles of society that would offer her the chance to make a respectable match. But even as he carefully arranged her social opportunities, a new thought kept circling in his mind. Was he really helping her? Or was he merely manipulating the situation for his own gain? One evening, as Marcus was preparing to leave his study, a knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find his secretary standing with a letter in hand. Your Grace, the secretary said. Miss Langford has requested to speak with you. She says it is urgent. Marcus raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. It was unusual for Beatrice to make such a direct request. Their last conversation had been rather formal, but it seemed there was something on her mind that required his immediate attention. Send her in, Marcus said, his voice steady, though his pulse quickened slightly at the thought of what she might want. A moment later, Beatrice entered the room. She looked as composed as ever, but there was a tightness to her posture that suggested something was weighing heavily on her mind. She held herself with the same intellectual poise that had intrigued Marcus from the start, but tonight there was something else in her gaze, a flicker of emotion he hadn't seen before. Your Grace, she said, her voice calm, but there was a sharpness to her tone that caught Marcus off guard. I believe you've been orchestrating my social rise. I appreciate the introductions and the opportunities you've provided. However, I need to ask you something. Why? Marcus was silent for a moment, the unexpected nature of her question catching him off guard. He had expected her to speak of marriage prospects, of her growing fame in certain circles. He had not expected her to call him out so directly, to demand an answer to a question that had been lurking at the back of his mind for some time. I suppose, he said slowly, that I've been helping you for the same reason anyone helps someone else in society. To advance one's position, to create opportunities, to win the bet. Beatrice nodded, her expression unreadable. The bet, she echoed. Yes, I suppose that's what this is about, isn't it? Marcus stood up from his desk, feeling the tension between them grow. He was a man who thrived on control, on precision, on planning every detail. But in that moment, as Beatrice stood before him, all his carefully constructed plans seemed to unravel. I've wondered, she continued, her voice steady but cutting through the silence like a blade, why you've taken such an interest in me. Is it because you genuinely believe in my abilities? Or is it simply because you saw a woman whose intellectual potential had been ignored, and you thought it was a game you could win? Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He wasn't prepared for her to turn the tables so completely. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain composed, to control the situation. But Beatrice had managed to strip away his defenses. And in doing so, she had forced him to confront the very thing he had been avoiding, his own motivations. Do you think I've been using you? He asked, his voice lower than usual, an edge of something deeper beneath the words. Do you think I'm playing some game, manipulating you for the sake of a bet? Beatrice met his gaze, her eyes flashing with something. Was it disappointment? Anger? That made his chest tighten. I think you've been using me as a pawn in a game you don't even fully understand, she replied. And I think you've been so focused on winning that you've forgotten what's at stake. You've made me into a project, a challenge, a wager, and I'm tired of it. The words hit Marcus like a blow. He had known deep down that his actions had been calculated, but hearing her say it so plainly made the reality of what he had done all the more clear. He had taken her intellect, her potential, and turned it into a game, a challenge to be won. He had used her, whether consciously or not, and the weight of that realization was almost more than he could bear. I never meant to make you feel like that, he said, his voice strained. I never wanted to manipulate you. And yet you did, she replied, her voice firm, unyielding. You've made me a part of your wager. You've made me an object of your success. And I'm done with it. The room felt smaller in that moment, the space between them charged with the intensity of everything unsaid. For a long time Marcus didn't speak. He simply stood there, trying to process the weight of her words, the sharpness of her accusation. And then, with a sense of resignation, he nodded. I understand, he said softly. And I'm sorry. Truly. But even as the words left his lips, he knew that his apology couldn't undo the damage. He had crossed a line, and now he had to live with the consequences. The days following the conversation with Beatrice were heavy with silence. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed her, not just as a man, but as someone who had once prided himself on understanding people, on reading them like books. The woman he had tried to manipulate had turned the tables on him so completely, forcing him to confront his own arrogance and pride. It was a defeat unlike any he had ever known. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about relationships, power, and respect. Beatrice, for her part, had withdrawn. She no longer made herself available to him in the way she once had. Every attempt Marcus made to speak with her was met with polite but firm resistance. She had begun to reassert control over her own narrative, making it clear that she would no longer be a part of his game, no longer a piece on his chessboard to be moved at his will. At first, Marcus tried to regain his footing. He threw himself back into the wager, reaching out to the same circles he had used to orchestrate Beatrice's social rise. But every introduction, every attempt to push her toward a match, felt hollow. Something had shifted. He wasn't doing this for the challenge anymore. He wasn't doing it for the £10,000 or the pride of winning. He was doing it for her. And that realization brought with it a fresh wave of frustration. What was he supposed to do now? What could he offer her when he had already shown her the worst parts of himself? Meanwhile, Beatrice's transformation continued to unfold, albeit in a way that Marcus hadn't anticipated. As the days passed, she became more sought after, not just for her intellectual prowess, but for her strength. London society began to take notice, not of her as a woman to be manipulated, but as an individual to be respected. The salons she had once avoided now clamored for her presence, and the men who had once overlooked her now sought her out, some for her mind, and others for more personal reasons. Lord Whitworth, the scholarly earl who had admired her from afar, became a more prominent fixture in her life. He respected her not just for her intellect, but for her courage in navigating the complex world of London society. He wasn't trying to win her over with flattery or empty gestures. He was genuinely interested in her thoughts, in her ideas. His attentions were sincere, and for the first time in a long while, Beatrice began to consider the possibility of marriage. Not as a necessity, but as something that could be built on mutual respect and understanding. But even as she engaged with Lord Whitworth, her mind kept returning to Marcus. She could not forget the way he had apologized, the sincerity in his voice. And yet, there was still a barrier between them, one that he had built and one that she could not easily tear down. She had been hurt by his actions, and while she recognized that he had changed, it wasn't enough for her to simply forgive and forget. Trust, once broken, was not easily mended. Marcus, too, found himself haunted by her. He had done the unthinkable. He had exposed his vulnerabilities, and in doing so, he had placed his pride and his social standing at risk. He couldn't understand why he cared so much about what Beatrice thought of him, why her opinion had started to matter more than his reputation. But there was no denying it. She had become the most important person in his life. The thought of losing her to another man, of seeing her with someone else, filled him with a quiet panic that he had never experienced before. The tipping point came at the Devonshire Ball. It was the season's most anticipated event, a gathering of London's elite where every important name could be found under one roof. Marcus had attended for years, but this time, everything felt different. He wasn't just there as a duke. He was there as a man who had something to prove. And the woman who had once been a mere subject of his wager, a challenge to win, was now at the center of his thoughts. As he entered the ballroom, his gaze immediately sought her out. Beatrice was standing near the far side of the room, engaged in conversation with Lady Whitmore, her sharp mind clearly on display as she debated some political theory. Her intellectual fire was undeniable, and Marcus could feel a surge of admiration wash over him. She wasn't just beautiful, she was brilliant, and the world was finally beginning to see her for what she truly was. But it was the moment she turned and caught his eye that everything changed. The tension in the room seemed to dissipate as their gazes locked. For a brief moment, the chaos of the ball, the music, the laughter, the whispers, faded into nothingness. All Marcus could see was Beatrice, standing there in the midst of it all, her expression unreadable but no longer distant. For the first time, he saw her not just as a woman he had manipulated, but as an equal. She didn't look away. She didn't flee from him. Instead, she held his gaze, her eyes clear, her posture straight. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something more powerful. Respect. It was then that Marcus realized that this wasn't about the wager anymore. It wasn't about winning or losing. It wasn't about his reputation or the £10,000. It was about what came next, about what kind of man he would be now that he had seen the world from a different perspective. As the evening wore on, Marcus found himself drawn to her, not with the same sense of competition that had initially fueled their interactions, but with something far deeper. He had seen her for what she truly was. A woman of remarkable intellect, courage, and strength. And that, he realized, was worth more than any victory he could have claimed. As the night came to a close, Marcus approached her, his steps slow but sure. Beatrice was talking with Lord Whitworth when he arrived, but when she saw him, her expression softened, just slightly. It was enough to make his heart race.